Our next and final speaker in the Evolutionary Origins of Speech Acts conference here at the University of Bucharest is Peter van Elswyk. I'm grateful to Peter for meeting him and for contributing to the conference. He's coming from Northwestern, and his talk today is titled From Mind Reading to Speech Acts, a Case Study with Assertion. Thanks so much, and please take it away.
Great. Everybody can hear me okay? Cool. Sorry I couldn't be present for some of the earlier talks. Time zone differences made that complicated, as well as getting my kindergartner out the door this morning to school. But I am pleased to be with you and excited to talk about this material. So as let's see, hold on, there we go. I take the target question in thinking about the evolution of speech acts to be a question about how speech acts result from or emerge from social cognition. So that's how I'm going to be approaching this question. I take speech acts to be irreducibly social, and so thinking about how speech acts evolve or emerge is a question about how they emerge from or are the byproduct of social cognition. Broadly, I think of social cognition as the processes and abilities that equip us to navigate a social world filled with unpredictable conspecific. So just as our minds are equipped to help us navigate a physical world, they are also similarly equipped to help us navigate a social world. In thinking about speech acts as being connected to social cognition, this is broadly nothing new. The Gricean tradition, where intentions play a starring role and the recognition of such intentions can be understood as giving a view in which social cognition is what explains how speech acts work. But obviously in thinking about social cognition, we're not limited to intention or intention recognition. That's one kind of ability that we arguably have, but it doesn't exhaust the ability that we have. So I'm broadly interested in that kind of approach. So I think then the way to think about the question about how speech acts have evolved is to think about the relevant processes and abilities, how those contribute to the emergence of speech acts. I think broadly the process of figuring this out, of identifying how social cognition contributes to the emergence of speech acts is a project, as I conceive of it, that has at least two steps. So the first step is to give mechanistic explanations of how speech acts work. So a lot of theorizing about speech acts takes place at a level of abstraction where people abstract away from, selectively ignore a lot of the psychological considerations that go into what it takes to perform that speech act. So a real clear example here would be, for example, Stalnacker's theory of assertion, where to perform an assertion is to propose to change a data structure, namely a data structure consisting of the information that's common ground between conversational participants. Stalnacker is explicit, including recently in his 2014 book, that it's a, quote, highly idealized and oversimplified theory, because he's just interested in the kinematics of kind of information exchange. But then there's a natural question when you're working with a framework like that: what are the underlying psychological mechanisms that explain how all of that stuff works? The theories are idealized to an extent by focusing on the kinematics, but the psychological questions kind of go unanswered. I think the same kind of stuff happens with norm-based theories of assertion too. There's focus on how do we individuate assertion thought of as a kind of move in conversation, as opposed to thinking about the underlying mechanisms that position or equip us to make those very kinds of moves. So I think the first step in thinking about how we get from social cognition to the emergence of speech acts from an evolutionary perspective, first we have to kind of start with the theory of how speech acts work and give a mechanistic explanation for some of the relevant features of that speech act before we can start connecting it to evolution. It's hard to just jump from a highly idealized theory to thinking about an evolutionary trajectory if we haven't kind of anchored it in something more psychological and more cognitive. So that's what I take kind of the first step of the project to be. And then the secondary step of the project is to then start thinking about what's the trajectory that causes the emergence of those mechanisms. So step one is identifying the mechanisms that explain the key features of a speech act, where those mechanisms are some processes or abilities that we have as part of our social cognition. And then the second step is thinking about the emergence of those kinds of things. So that naturally then kind of means that my talk today is going to kind of have two steps to it. I'm going to suggest some mechanistic explanations of key features of speech acts, and then I'm going to say a little bit about potentially how to think about the emergence or evolution of those particular processes abilities as a window into when speech acts showed up. In particular, my focus is going to be on the knowledge norm of assertion to give a kind of proof of concept. My reason for this is I think this is the correct theory of assertion. So this is something I've defended in a few papers. Even if you are no fan of the knowledge norm of assertion, I think it's, as one of the more popular theories kind of on the market, it's worthwhile to see if there's a way to kind of give the kind of story that we're talking about here, where we can mechanistically explain how it works in terms of features of social cognition, and then ground that out in a plausible story about its evolutionary history. Broadly, I think if we're going to give theories of assertion and other speech acts that are sophisticated, part of that sophistication needs to be a continuity with the things we're learning about how mind and language work from the cognitive sciences. And so you can see this project as at least showing that you can do so for the knowledge norm of assertion, even if you maybe don't buy it yourself. So that's going to be the focus. I think what I'm going to be up to is going to generalize, and I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. But my focus is going to be on the knowledge norm of assertion. Okay, so in thinking about the knowledge norm of assertion, when it was initially kind of really popularized by Tim Williamson's work in especially the early 2000s book, Knowledge and Its Limits, he thought of it as a kind of constitutive rule, as something that characterized assertion as a move in the same way that a constitutive rule might tell you how a bishop moves in chess, etc. I think that way of thinking about the knowledge norm of assertion is kind of incorrect, because I think it obscures key details and obviously makes it a little bit more tricky to think about how to anchor it to social cognition. So I'm going to be making a series of adjustments to how we think about the knowledge norm of assertion along the way, to kind of make it more, to soften it up and make it more suitable to the kind of mechanistic reduction I'm suggesting that we do. So building on co-authored work with Matthew Benton in a recent paper, we suggest that we should think about the knowledge norm of assertion as dividing into kind of two parts. So the first part being the idea that assertion as a speech act is associated with a signal indicating that the speaker knows the content of what they've asserted. I'm using signal here as a kind of catch-all term. If you want to say express, if you want to say speakers represent themselves, this other terminology will work. But mostly what I'm interested in kind of is the non-normative side of assertion here, right? Which is the fact that there's a kind of expectation after a speaker uses a declarative sentence to perform an assertion that they know, or at least have purport to know, or at least you can take them to know. That kind of inference is what I mean by when I think about what I'm calling the knowledge signal. That's importantly different than some of the normative considerations, because I think you motivate questions about assertion being associated with this kind of empirical expectation, or at least that they've represented themselves in some way. You motivate this by different data than you would kind of normative stuff. But obviously then the second part is that assertion is associated with the norm, or certain concepts of normative expectations as opposed to empirical expectations about how the speaker ought to behave in the course of conversation. So you can blame a speaker if they don't fulfill kind of the relevant expectation. You can hold them accountable to it, etc. So I take these to be kind of the two sides of thinking about the knowledge norm, which means the project of thinking about how to give mechanistic explanations for these features of assertion is a question of how do we give a mechanistic explanation for what I'm calling the K signal? So what's the mechanism that is part of our social cognition that explains why assertion is associated with this signal, why speakers express or represent themselves as knowing, and then also giving a mechanistic explanation for why assertion is associated with a norm requiring the speaker to behave in a certain way when performing assertion. So in dividing the knowledge norm of assertion in half, or at least in two components, we kind of get a clear target for what we need to give mechanistic explanations for these two parts. So that's going to kind of be the focus of the first step, is giving mechanistic explanations for both of these things, both what I'm calling the signal and then what I'm calling the norm. So when it comes to the signal, my suggestion is that the mechanism by which this is which we can analyze or understand this in our theories of assertion is that it's a result of mind reading. So what it is for a speaker to express themselves, so to speak, or to represent themselves as knowing, is that hearers spontaneously represent the speaker as knowing in response to their use of a declarative. And the kind of mind reading I have in mind here is importantly non-Gricean. I don't think that it goes by way of a speaker first having intention for the hearer to recognize that the speaker has the belief or has knowledge in what they're asserting. The kind of picture you get in kind of Grice's revised versions of how we thought about this stuff, or the kind of picture you find in Bach and Harnish. I don't think it has to go by way of a speaker having an intention that's recognized, and then we get downstream of that some sort of mind reading that the speaker knows or believes the content of their assertion. Instead, I think it's a spontaneous and direct form of mind reading. So it's importantly then non-recursive, and I think that's something to kind of keep in view. I think it's a direct non-recursive kind of mind reading, as opposed to the kind of second, third, potentially fourth order mind reading that you can occasionally get in these Gricean proposals. It'll help to say a little bit about how I'm thinking about mind reading. So I'm understanding mind reading, I think in a pretty traditional way, as our ability to track the mental states of other people for the purpose of understanding their behavior. And I think that there's a lot of emerging evidence that at least part of our mind reading involves a very fast, spontaneous attribution of mental states. That might not exhaust our mind reading. So if you know this literature, you know that there's a debate about whether or not, for example, there are two systems of mind reading, a fast, spontaneous one, a more cumbersome, slow one. There are views in which there's a fast one, and then we can kind of iteratively arrive at more complicated, more representationally complex forms of mental representation. I'm kind of staying neutral on a lot of those broader questions, but I think a commonality they have is that mind reading has a kind of fast, spontaneous attribution of mental states as part of our background cognition. I can say a little bit more in questions if people are curious about whether or not there's evidence for the kind of mind reading that I'm suggesting here. I think there is, that we do, as part of our mind reading, represent the speaker as having some attitude towards the content of their assertion. So I take my proposal that the mechanism by which speakers express or represent an attitude, in other words, the thing that mechanistically explains what I've called the K signal, I think we have independent experimental evidence that that is a deployment of mind reading. One thing that's worth noting here, I haven't given you any arguments for thinking that the attitude associated with assertion is knowledge. It's mostly something I think is motivated independently. I do think, though, kind of interestingly, if we start to think about mind reading as the mechanism by which an attitude is expressed or represented through the act of assertion, we can kind of uncover new arguments for why knowledge is the attitude associated with assertion. So just kind of quickly to get these on the table, and so we can return to them if people are interested, in a paper I'm in the middle of writing, I think there's an argument you can make from child development that the relevant, if what mechanistically explains the attitude component of assertion is mind reading, we can look at A, when kids are capable of using assertions, and B, what kind of mind reading they're capable of in that same time frame as a window into what attitude potentially could be associated with assertion. And I think when you do that, what you see is something like kids are able to use and distinguish assertion by 18 to 24 months. They are capable of factive mind reading at that time. I do not think that the evidence at present shows that they're capable of non-factive mind reading at that time. So in other words, if you're familiar with kind of how the history of the mind reading literature has gone, it started out with a focus on verbal false belief tasks, which seemed to suggest that kids couldn't mind read until later. Then there was a turn to nonverbal false belief tasks, which for a long time seemed to suggest that kids were capable of non-factive attitude-oriented mind reading by this kind of time window. But less appreciated is a lot of these nonverbal false belief tests have failed to replicate in recent years, quite considerably so, with potentially a showing too that the relevant nonverbal measures used don't converge in any way. So a kid can perform really well on one of these and not. When it comes to false belief detection. So there's an interesting interpretation of this and a kind of factive turn that's taking place in a lot of theorizing about mind reading, which suggests that, yeah, these false belief tests don't seem to replicate on the nonverbal measures, but the factive mind reading does seem to replicate on the very same nonverbal measures. So we can get into that later, but if that's the kind of thing that interests you. But I think the evidence has shifted recently, suggesting that kids are capable of factive mind reading in this time window, not capable of non-factive mind reading, which is some reason to think that the attitude is knowledge. There's an argument that you can pair what I'm suggesting with too. There's a recent paper by Evan Westra and Jennifer Nagel in Cognition called Mind Reading and Conversation, where they also give an argument for how knowledge could be the attitude that's represented. The basic idea is that knowledge representation or representing someone as knowing something is less complex, and so as a result, less computationally taxing than non-factive mind reading. And so it's a reason to think that if an attitude is attributed spontaneously, it's going to be a factive attitude as opposed to a non-factive attitude. I say all of that very quickly. Each of these things could easily be their own talk, but to at least get it out there that in starting to think about assertion, the signaling or expressing feature of assertion as being mechanistically explained by mind reading, it allows us to explore that feature of assertion in ways we haven't before, right? We don't just have to reflect on, intuitions about lottery assertions or the kinds of things that initially motivated the knowledge norm. In connecting it mechanistically to mind reading, we can start to think about issues like development or computationally taxing representations as a perhaps window into what attitude is involved with assertion. So that's the first kind of part of the mechanistic explanation, doing it in terms of mind reading. When it comes to the K norm, my suggestion is one that builds on actually, I think Peter Graham is probably the first person to start suggesting that the norms of assertion are social norms. But this is the suggestion I want to make here, is that the normative expectations that take place when it comes to assertion are owed to social norms being operative in a population. So it's not a constitutive rule, as Williamson and others kind of envisioned it early on. Instead, it's a regularity in behavior brought about by a kind of constellation in preferences and expectations. So to think about social norms a teeny bit, I think norms are something that compel compliance through a variety of different mechanisms. And one of the things that's worth noting is that norms are another type of component of our social cognition. Just like mind reading helps us figure out the uncertain behavior of conspecifics by allowing us to kind of see, so to speak, their mental states that's relevant to their behavior. Social norms similarly allow us to navigate the uncertain behavior of conspecifics, because that behavior becomes less uncertain when it's choreographed, to use Gintis's term, by various social norms and common sets of expectations. So I tend to think about norms along the Behavior kind of way, though I'll circle back to this in the end, where norms involve a kind of empirical expectation that people comply, that people do the regularity in question, and a normative expectation that you expect everybody else to expect as much, and that there's a preference for compliance that may result in sanction in the event that there's non-compliance. So norms are something that bottom out in, on her way of putting it, empirical expectations about how people will behave, and normative expectations about people, how people ought to behave. And so norms emerge or arise when we have these two types of things. It's not enough to just have empirical expectations, and it's not enough to just have normative expectations. You need both for the emergence of a social norm. On this way of thinking, if we kind of plug in thinking about what I've called the K-norm, what we're looking at then is the possibility of there being empirical expectations that you expect other people to know that P, and then normative expectations that you kind of expect everybody else to, and that there's a preference for compliance and the possibility of sanction with non-compliance. So to kind of complete the mechanistic explanation, we would need a story for why these empirical expectations can show up, and why these normative expectations can also show up. To that end, I think on the front of explaining where the empirical expectations come from, I think it's natural to just say that mind reading is kind of what causes this. If we're all kind of wired, so to speak, as part of our social cognition to spontaneously represent people as knowing the content of what they've asserted, then it is the case that a sufficiently large subset of the population expect each other to know that P when they assert, where the notion of expectation here is reflected in our spontaneous attribution of knowledge when people perform an active assertion. So I think the empirical expectation part kind of comes for free once we've already got the mind reading component in place, suggesting that we are engaged in this default spontaneous representation of people as knowing things. The question then is, how do we get to the normative expectation part, where there is expecting other people to expect as much, and a preference for compliance as opposed to non-compliance. Here, I think there are a few different options that I'll kind of quickly mention. So it's not uncommon for kind of regularities in behavior to just develop into social norms. This is sometimes called the descriptive to prescriptive tendency. And this starts to happen pretty early, kind of in the same time window that children start to show proficiency with assertion. So you might think that what's going on is there's a kind of regularity that solidifies on what we expect of other people, and that regularity kind of turns into a norm as a result. Another option, sometimes in the relevant literature on mind reading, people contrast with mind shaping, the idea that the way we represent other people creates expectancy effects that then starts to play a normative role in regulating their behavior. So we start out kind of empirically representing them, but we don't stop there. We kind of want people to fit with how we're representing them. The mind shaping people sometimes see themselves as offering an alternative to the mind reading stuff, whereas there's a middle ground position, which I find plausible, where both of these things can be going on. We are tracking mental states, but part of that tracking behavior can have a normative effect through the generation of these expectancy effects. So it might not be a very general mechanism from regularity to norms. It might be a process which mind reading contributes to in a really important kind of way. It kind of supercharges or draws upon the regularity to norm development, but it does so in a way because of something perhaps special about mind reading. The final option that's just worth kind of noting is there's a tradition starting with Millikan, obviously, in thinking that the function of a declarative clause is to kind of share good information, produce true beliefs in hearers. You might think too that in order for it to have that function, you need some sort of external mechanism to ensure that it has that function in an evolutionarily stable way. To this end, a number of people have proposed that social norms perform that role. So they help declaratives perform their function of producing true beliefs stably by having social norms in place that kind of police the use of declaratives to make sure that a sufficient number of them are still performed in a way that the function is performed. Broadly, you might think of social norms as playing a role in deception management, making sure that deception is at least minimized to a sufficient enough degree that declaratives can continue to have this function. So you might think that norms emerge not necessarily because of something connected to mind reading, but also not something totally general like the regularity to norm trend that I was talking about before, but they emerge to play a special role in ensuring the evolutionary stability over time of a declarative as a device for sharing true information. All of these, though, give us our possible pathways that we get the normative expectations component of the social norm being in place, which allows us to then have mechanistic explanations for both features of assertion that I've brought into view if you're working with the knowledge norm of assertion. So the K signal comes from mind reading, spontaneous mind reading of the speaker, and the K norm comes by way of social norms that either kind of emerge independently or in conjunction with the mind reading. So what I want to do now is kind of do the second step. I want to talk a little bit about, now that we've kind of got our mechanisms in view, mind reading, social norms, I want to then think a little bit about the role that these play in the emergence of speech acts evolutionarily. So I'm going to kind of do the classic contrast between thinking about young children and then thinking about sophisticated primates as a kind of way to think about what needs to be in the startup kit, so to speak, for you to be able to have the relevant bits of social cognition to engage in speech acts. So in thinking about what kids are capable of in this window, I think that there's evidence, as suggested before, that they're able to track knowledge and at least a lack of knowledge via mind reading. I think the jury's still out on whether they can do false belief type reasoning, but they can certainly track knowledge and ignorance. There's evidence that they're able to participate in social norms rather early, rather quickly. A lot of these studies, if you know them, are pretty funny. It has to do with kids policing the behavior of puppets. And they start doing so very quickly after kind of learning from an experimenter how puppets should behave. They very quickly start to police those expectations on the puppets, which is taken as evidence for their ability to quickly take up and participate in social norms. And as I was suggesting before, I think there's a variety of evidence that they're able to use and distinguish speech acts like assertion. Importantly, the speech acts that tend to be associated with a dedicated clause type, right? So asserting, questioning, commanding. More complicated indirect acts, I think, are a separate question. And then when we're thinking about chimpanzees, I think it's a little bit, there's more controversy to be had. I am on team factive mind reading when it comes to chimpanzees. I do think that they're able to track knowledge and lack of knowledge via mind reading. So they at least share that with young children. At least a certain way of thinking about social norms that Andrews talks about in a recent paper called Naive Normativity. It looks like that they're able to participate in something norm-like, insofar as they seem to be engaging in maintenance of regularities and behavior in a pretty deliberate way, where if you are departing from the kind of norm or rule, there's going to be some sort of consequence in terms of how others treat you. She wants to at least argue that if we weaken our notion of norms, if we weaken the kind of beaky stuff I was talking about earlier, so it's not as cognitively demanding in terms of expectations, it looks like chimpanzees are capable of participating in some types of social norms. And yet it doesn't look like they are using and distinguishing or doing speech acts that have features like what I've called the K signal and the K norm. So to kind of elaborate that on a little bit more, it does seem like they have factive mind reading. It does seem like they at least engage in something that's norm-like because they're trying to maintain the establishment of certain regularities in behavior. But neither the factive mind reading nor this maintaining regularities in behavior seems to be directed to informative signaling. Most of these things are just deployed with respect to how to kind of socially navigate access to sex and food. So they will be alert to representing who knows where the food is, or whether or not that the dominant male is in the presence of the relevant female, but if you're a non-dominant male and you're trying to copulate with. So mind reading plays a big role here. Punishment for not complying with behavioral regularities also play a role with respect to sex and food. Doesn't seem like it's implied to informative signaling, with a kind of window into this being deceptive alarm calls, right? So deceptive alarm calls are something that are issued to procure access to both. So you might say that a predator is nearby because you want to get some food, or you might say that a predator is nearby because you want to get something else. But deceptive alarm calls don't seem to be something that obviously involves kind of mind reading. Here I'm leaning on some of Josh Armstrong's really excellent work. This is a little bit not obvious, but it's at least worth flagging that it's not obviously applied to factive mind reading. But there also doesn't seem to be punishment for these deceptive types of alarm calls. So in some kind of populations of chimpanzees in the wild, there's a whole lot of deceptive alarm call signaling that just people kind of comply with or live with. It's part of the kind of normal feeding process, which doesn't seem like it's something that is heavily deterred, or behavioral regularity to not do that is maintained in any kind of way. So this gives us a kind of difference between chimps and children. And so I want to sketch maybe two ways of thinking about what's going on here, and then I'll wind down. So the first is the one option, if you think that there's a distinct language faculty, you might just think that that's the missing ingredient, that the chimpanzees have the relevant social cognition. They've got the mind reading, they've got the maintenance of behavior via norms, but they don't have a language faculty that gives them a declarative clause for social cognition to transform the use of that clause into the act type of assertion. So this would be one way to think about the importance of the language faculty to the evolution of certain types of speech acts. You need the social cognition to kind of organize around something in order to convert that something into something like a speech act. And in this case, perhaps that's what's going on. The social cognition is there, the language faculty is not. And so as a result, you can't yet have a speech act like assertion. One way to go. Another way to go is to take a more standard view about social norms. So the Andrews paper that I was mentioning is making the argument that chimpanzees have some sort of social norms because there's a maintenance of regularity in behavior, especially around food, sex, and then also infant care is one of the other things. But the kind of standard view is that chimpanzees lack social norms. So in contrast, for example, to the studies I was mentioning before, where kids very quickly start policing the behavior of third-party puppets to be in compliance with a regularity that they learn from an experimenter, in similar types of experiments, chimpanzees don't behave that kind of way. And so it's long been thought that they don't have social norms in the ways that I've been suggesting. So on this picture, then the missing ingredient is the social norm. So they have arguably the factive mind reading. They've got various forms of information sharing signaling. But what they lack is norms to kind of go from all of that to assertion. So they're representing each other perhaps as having knowledge or ignorance in the relevant kind of way, but there isn't yet maintenance of people needing to know or being expected to know or being preferred to know because they don't have the relevant bits of social cognition there. So to kind of put the picture together, if we're thinking about the knowledge norm as consisting in the K signal and the K norm, as I've been suggesting, I suggested that the mechanism for the K signal was factive mind reading, and the mechanism for the K norm was social norms. But if we're starting to think about kind of the evolutionary trajectory here, you need potentially the language faculty to get to factive mind reading of the relevant behavior. And you need social norms potentially in conjunction with the K signal to get to the K norm. which means kind of developmentally, it's the language faculty and social norms, which are a key part of the emergence of speech acts. So not giving a kind of non-disjunctive answer here, but at least thinking about the difference between children and chimpanzees with respect to how I've been thinking about assertion vis-a-vis the knowledge norm, in thinking about the differences that could be relevant to why chimps don't seem to have the knowledge norm, but children seem to be proficient with it. These are the things that are kind of candidate options for why that's the case. So a picture either on which chimpanzees have the relevant social cognition, but not the language faculty as a kind of organizing principle for that social cognition to then work with, or a picture on which they don't necessarily need the language faculty, but it's that they don't have the same amount of social cognition as we do. It's the lacking of norms as a way of maintaining behavior, especially communicative behavior, that's missing. And so that's one of the things that leads distinctively to the evolution or emergence of a speech act like assertion among creatures like us. So to kind of summarize up, I've suggested that the key features of assertion are what I've called the K signal and the K norm. I've suggested that both of those things can be given mechanistic explanations by appealing to processes or abilities from social cognition. So in particular, mind reading explains the K signal, and social norms explains what I've called K norm. Given the different abilities of children and chimpanzees, it looks like assertion could not have evolved without the language faculty, mind reading, and or social norms, with the exact combination of these things not being totally clear from at least what I've considered so far. But it's at least a mix of needing a suite of certain abilities in social cognition definitely are playing a necessary and perhaps sufficient role in terms of the emergence of speech acts. And though I've focused exclusively on assertion so far, I think what goes for assertion plausibly goes for other speech acts, at least other speech acts that are associated with a dedicated clause type. So acts of questioning and acts of commanding being included here. Again, not sure exactly what to say about indirect speech acts because I think that's a different ball game a little bit. But we can then think about the evolution of these speech acts in a similar kind of way. So what's the mechanistic explanation for how those speech acts have certain distinguishing features? And then how does the emergence of those relevant mechanisms that explain those features, how do those emerge or evolve, right? So it's natural, for example, to think about with the act of questioning, as expressing curiosity about the answer. And so ways of socially expressing curiosity seems to be part of what distinguishes questioning as a kind of act. If we were to think about the mind reading that goes into questioning, for example, a natural thought is that when we represent speakers as asking questions, the natural thought is that they have a desire to know the answer to the question. And one of the things that's interesting in some of the relevant mind reading and question literature is that even pretty young children seem to be pretty good at telling the difference between a genuine question and a quiz question based upon how they're representing the knowledge of the person asking the question. So if they take the speaker to know the answer, they kind of quickly resolve it as being a test question as opposed to a canonical one. It's when they're representing the speaker as ignorant that they default in terms of the speaker is desiring to know for themselves type of understanding. So mind reading still seems to also, at least with questioning, play a role plausibly in kind of mechanistically explaining how we understand the purpose or point of questioning. Though I don't obviously have time to give a complete kind of story mechanistically for question like I did for assertion. I'm at least optimistic that such a story can be told and then at least suggest a certain way we might think about the evolution of those speech acts in terms of how those mechanisms kind of arrived on the scene and where it became part of our kind of cognitive startup kit. So that is it for me. Thanks for letting me be the last talk of your conference here. And again, sorry I couldn't have been for all of the other excellent talks that happened before.
Thank you so much. On to Q&A. Are there questions or comments from the room? let's, let me just, oh, I see there's a question online from Christina. Please go ahead.
Thanks. I was wondering if we have a knowledge first view and infants first only have knowledge, whether in that case, when infants only have knowledge, whether we need a case signal. And one might think that we need a belief signal, but we don't need a case signal if that is the default. And if that's the case, then probably knowledge can be achieved without mind reading. So if something like assertion would be possible for chimp, which I think is not possible without language, but it could be possible in the same default way as it would be possible for children when they only have knowledge and not yet believe. Did you hear
cut
me?
out. Yeah, I heard, I think most of it. You cut out a little bit in the middle. Can you say a little bit more about your thinking about why we wouldn't need case signal if there is factive mind reading?
Yes, so the idea was that infants start with the knowledge, and I agree with you. But in that case, if they don't have belief yet, only knowledge, then they don't need a signal for being knowledge because everything is knowledge what they have. So at least in the beginning of the development, they don't need a knowledge signal, even if they might need later when they have both knowledge and belief. And the idea would be, if that is possible, that although I doubt that chimps can have assertion, but if they would have some way, I would think that if chimps has something like interrogation, assertion, I think that's a possibility, like some kind of force is different, then you don't need mind reading, because the way as the infants don't need mind reading for knowledge, because everything which comes is just knowledge, because there isn't anything else. So where is the signal, it would be always knowledge which is transmitted, so you don't need a knowledge signal. And if that's possible for infants because they don't have belief yet, then it might be possible for chimps as well.
That's really interesting. Thanks for elaborating on that. I mean, what your question makes me think about is maybe even still in the picture that I've sketched, there's still an intermediary stage missing, because there's the kind of assertion-y thing that kids and potentially chimps are doing that you're kind of drawing attention to, that maybe the signal part isn't really playing a role in. And then we get to the signal thing for something like human adults. But what leads to the emergence of the signaling thing is not something I've really spoken to. I kind of was taking that for granted. So I appreciate the comment in thinking that maybe kids and chimps have, right, a kind of proto-assertion that lacks the signal, but still seems to play a similar kind of functional role. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Great, thanks both. Your other comments, questions? Mitch, come on up.
Hi, Peter.
Hi, Mitch.
Hey, how you doing? I think I was able to process most of what you said, and it might be repeating some of what Christina was asking about. But one thing that was striking me about your talk was that it sounds as if from your approach, something like the norm of assertion sort of emerges fully formed from the foreheads of all the people in the society or something like that. And I'm wondering whether it's possible to tell a plausible story according to which there's something or proto-assertoric that comes on the scene prior to that, because it seems like assertion's a pretty complicated and articulated norm-involving process. I'm wondering if there's a story that could be told that would give us an account of how there'd be something more primitive than that involves, for example, less constrained ways of transmitting information that wouldn't be quite, where the information transmitted is not via assertion, but something prior or more primitive than it. So I guess I'm just kind of casting around for any way in which you might give us a story about how we got from nothing like assertion to assertion as it exists now. And whether, the other direction, whether you can imagine a sort of development of what you would call social cognition, what I guess I would probably call cultural evolution, in which something even perhaps more demanding than assertion would be the norm, at least for certain purposes, and what that would be like.
Yeah, great question. I'll start with the last one first. I mean, I definitely, on the picture that I'm painting, how assertion works is very contingent. So the possibility of there being something that's more demanding, or having a need for something that's more demanding, definitely could have happened. And it's an interesting question about whether or not we do have, such speech acts. So I know you and I both have a common interest, right, in whether you can strengthen or weaken these types of things. And so I think we have an interest in a whole family of different strengths, with assertion kind of being the default or canonical one. I think one way to think about how to have something proto-assertion or proto-assertoric, if I'm thinking about kind of reverse engineering things, if we're thinking about assertion norm gives us the signal and then the norm, and then I've suggested it's mind reading and social norms, questions about, well, what are the kind of precursors to mind reading and what are the kind of precursors to social norms? So maybe not quite social norms, but kinds of behavioral maintenance that's not norm-like, and kinds of representation where we're maybe this is where the Joshua Armstrong stuff is relevant, where there's kind of coordination of mental states without recognition of others' mental states. If you have that kind of Armstrong-like proto-mind reading and then kind of proto-norm behavior maintenance simultaneously, then you might have something that seems to have both kind of dimensions of what I've characterized assertion as having, the signal-y aspect and the normie aspect, though in much kind of weaker forms than in the full-fledged way it looks now. So that's one way to think about it, is what kinds of precursors to mind reading and precursors to norms might there be. Some thinking I've done about that is there's some people, though, that when they look at the kind of mind reading literature, one of their reactions is that it's, in animals in particular, that it's not mind reading, it's tracking, line of sight kind of stuff. And if you're thinking about early mind reading as being factive and a kind of knowledge first kind of thing, then the line of sight stuff as an alternative explanation and mind reading, the gap between those closes a little bit, because you might think that looking at line of sight is a means of engaging in factive mind reading. And so thinking about the precursor, at least, to kind of factive mind reading, it's natural to think that tracking things like line of sight is a kind of natural precursor. I don't know yet what I want to say about some of this Andrew stuff about norms among chimpanzees. I kind of want to myself say that that's more proto-norm stuff, where you've got maintaining regularities, but you haven't kind of, I don't think the chimpanzees feel guilty when they violate the norms, right? They're not internalizing them, for example. So yeah, and getting me to think about what are some of the intermediaries. They're going to have to be more kind of proto forms of assertion, but for both components to be present, we would need something like line of sight tracking plus behavioral maintenance around informative signaling. And though we have proto forms of those, it seems, so having those surround informative signaling, I don't know, it becomes less obvious looking kind of across different species where that shows up. Maybe certain types of birds in sexual signaling, but even there, still really tricky. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. But I would just follow up on one point about the feeling guilty for breaking a norm. Seems to me in our own species, we've got norms that we follow, the breaking of which may well not cause a guilt feeling or any kind of internal representation of a violation of a norm. So, there are all kinds of unconscious rules that we follow, conversational turn taking, personal space when we're having face-to-face conversation and so forth, that one can, it's clear that we follow them because we feel, well, uncomfortable when someone breaks them in our presence. But I'm not sure if guilt or any kind of reflective awareness of having violated something is part of the picture in those cases. So,
Sure.
and and by way of slight defense of Kristen, I would say that might be the kind of thing she's thinking about. These things that are norm governed, but not in ways that are indicated by any internal representations and consciousness or anything like that, that I've done something bad or wrong in violation of social norms. So there might be some space in that area.
Yeah, discomfort. Sure. Yeah, that's helpful.
Good. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Other comments, questions, rejoinders, either in the room or online? I'm just gonna insert a little clip of my own and see if it works out, and then I might have a question, not sure. Thanks for the talk. So at some point, I think you talked about mind reading in terms of mechanisms. Is that an accurate way to put it? I mean, I would have thought that of the several available views in theory of mind, you got the theory, you got the simulation view, you got rationalizing view, you got the no view from Apperly and others, right? I mean, it just didn't seem as though they're very mechanistic. Perhaps some varieties of simulation could be construed as mechanistic, but I just wondered if you need that, or if, quasi mechanisms or pseudo mechanisms or whatever. Dan Weisskopf had this older piece on why everybody is hyped about mechanisms in cognitive psychology, and they don't really need to use the word. And so I just wondered if you're paying tribute to that sort of tradition, or if you need it.
I don't think I need it. I like the terminology. I'm kind of taking it from the philosophy of biology, literature a little bit, in thinking about the kind of explanatory strategy where you explain why something at a higher level has the properties or features that it does by explaining how it does at a lower level. That's the kind of broad explanatory strategy that Bechdel's work and kind of explanation in biology, he calls that mechanistic. So that's more what I'm up to, because I think as I was kind of saying at the beginning, speech acts are often theorized in a highly idealized way where someone's interested in kind of what happens at the level of a conversational system, while selectively ignoring everything else. So I think it's helpful, or at least I find it helpful, to think about kind of level-based explanations. And so that's mostly what I'm kind of paying homage to in talking this way, is thinking about an interlevel explanation whereby I explain how something at a higher level has it by explaining how it does at a lower level. But yeah, I don't mean to be kind of taking a side on, on some of these broader issues in mind reading.
That's terrific. Thanks so much. And if there are sort of other rejoinders, sort of different question. I mean, might be related. So I might be getting this wrong, and if so, just stop me and just amend whatever it is I thought you might be saying. So at certain stages in their development, kids are prone to assign factive attitudes to others by way of sort of mind reading them. And this sort of makes it natural for knowledge to come to be a norm for assertion. Is that the sort of general gist of it? Because if that's the case,
sure, yeah.
Okay, so if that's the case, I was thinking about the deception management business, because as kids grow, as we all know, assertions become more and more sophisticated. And so if it's a matter of developmental stage, why couldn't belief, as opposed to knowledge, come to be a more appropriate norm for assertion when, I don't know, they just meet a more sophisticated environment? So if the consideration that's put forward was sort of developmental, it would seem as though it would be anchored to that specific stage or those specific stages, and then how would that support the view that knowledge is norm for assertion sort of throughout, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is something I've thought a little bit about. I mean, at the very least, it would if I'm right about the kind of time frame stuff, it means kids are asserting when they can only reliably do factive mind reading. So they can engage in an assertion with knowledge is the relevant attitude, but that doesn't get to knowledge is the only attitude. Why don't they shed that at a later date, which is one way of understanding your question, or why isn't it kind of more disjunctive at a later date? What would cause it to change? This is where I think the stuff I'm saying about childhood development is not independent, probably, of the Westra and Nagel stuff about the complexity of factive versus non-factive mind reading. So they just kind of give a nice argument, which paired with what I'm saying would suggest that, well, knowledge is the thing that's most suitable for that spontaneous attitude attribution, as opposed to kind of belief. That's not to say there isn't a role for it. It's maybe something that we reprocess and then go to something non-factive. We have all sorts of purposes for it. But that would be a reason why it stays knowledge, as opposed to starts off knowledge and then gets shed. Because it's definitely correct that in a way that you would expect given factive mind reading, kids are really trusting kind of early on. And then get way more discerning as they get older. So Paul Harris's work on this is really great. And so there's a natural way that the suggestion you have kind of can be motivated, which is like they go from like very trusting to a little bit more cagey, and that could be thought of as a change in terms of what the norm of assertion is. I'm inclined for kind of the complexity stuff to think that there's not a change, but that's a change instead in terms of, how sophisticated their epistemic vigilance is, so to speak. As opposed to a norm one. But that's a great question, and I need to be thinking a little bit more about if there are other ways to suggest that it would stay that way, beyond leaning on then the complexity considerations.
And just, I don't mean to be stalling, just a quick follow-up to that. So you mentioned Jennifer Nagel's work, right? So I was just wondering, right? So suppose you're right, and knowledge does stay throughout as the say primary norm for assertion.
Yeah.
If you just think of sort of these epistemic invariantism worries, right? What does that mean? Perhaps as kids grow, they become not just more discerning, but also more epistemically anxious. And so skeptical worries might they might delve on those more. And so what gets to count as knowledge gets to be more precious. And the costs and risks that are associated with attributing knowledge to others might increase. And so would that still lend content to the norm, to the thought that knowledge is a primary norm for assertion, or would that change with the epistemic context in question? And would kids, as they become more enculturated, sort of become sensitive to this in a growing fashion? So I was just wondering what the overall normative profile of the claim was.
Yeah. A few thoughts on this question. So there's emergence about when kids are able to assert, and then there's a kind of separate question, and I have a harder time finding relevant developmental psychology on this question, but when kids are able to engage in weakened form of assertion, hedged assertion, for example, because hedging opens up a way to, in a sense, engage in information sharing, but you are not attributing knowledge to yourself, or you are in how you're interpreting somebody else's, right? You're free to not have it carry the high status of knowledge, right? So other types of in the neighborhood types of speech act stuff, when does this emerge and when does this show up? As best I can tell, it's definitely later than when they first have facility with assertion. Some evidence for this is just thinking about the development of or acquisition of the relevant types of verbs, because kids are able to work with no pretty reliably, but they keep rejecting think or believe statements as if they were factive until much later. So there's a lot of great work coming out of University of Maryland with Valentina Card and Jeff Lidd's stuff. And their kind of hypothesis, they don't quite put it this way, but their hypothesis is something like kids are treating the hedge statements as just normal assertions. And if normal assertions are factive, that's why they're rejecting them. So it's clear that kids don't have at the same time the ability to engage in hedged assertion, because that requires sophistication with attitude verbs that they lack. But once they get that, it seems that that's a kind of off-ramp towards some of these issues that you're talking about. You don't have to assert it. And you don't also have to interpret the other person as having asserting it. You can kind of reinterpret them as engaged in more hedging stuff. So that's relevant to some of this. I do feel like there's this general thing about the knowledge norm where, you know, this is my kind of like candid way of thinking about it. When you look at all of the relevant data that people use to adjudicate between theories of assertion, and you're sensitive to, for example, how a theory would fit with a theory of lying, a theory of testimonial warrant, theory of this other stuff, I think above and beyond, the knowledge norm just comes out on top. But there's this kind of suspicion that's just very hard to shake, where it's like, really? That demanding, that special thing? How could that be the norm of assertion? And I don't totally know what the right kind of deflationary or kind of error theory for like why there's this incredulous response that I even feel when I feel like when I'm working through the data. The knowledge norm is going to clearly come out on top. So there's things to say here maybe about there being kinds of knowledge, that there's a kind of animal knowledge or a reflective knowledge, to use Ernest Sosa's distinction. People in response to the factive mind reading literature have also kind of said similar things, albeit not in a way that's engaging with the Sosa work. They've kind of just stumbled into it. So that might be some of it, right? One potential way to think about it is maybe there's kind of two kinds of knowledge. There's an easier knowledge, and then there's a more demanding knowledge. And then there are questions, obviously, about whether contextualism is the right way to think about how there could be such flavors of knowledge. And again, I don't know exactly how I want to think about some of these things. I used to be.
Could I just insert a very quick follow-up here? So, is there any evidence to your knowledge about the distinction between animal and reflective knowledge, or easy and right? So, does any of that feature in naive psychology at any point, or is this just something we might sort of ex post facto conjecture about?
It's how some people have talked about. It's a great question. It's less something people have clear kind of evidence for. It is something that people have theorized about and thinking about mind reading who aren't philosophers. And that's kind of what makes it at least kind of interesting, is that they've kind of stumbled into, or maybe Sosa stumbled into, but there's a kind of unintentional convergence in thinking that maybe with factive mind reading, there's kind of two grades of knowledge that takes place in terms of what's mind read. But is there experimental evidence that kind of clearly teases that theory apart from other ones? No, it's just a way of interpreting data that can be interpreted other ways. But that's a potential, at least, way to go, is to kind of tinker with your view of knowledge, as opposed to giving up on the knowledge norm or something like that. Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much. Other thoughts, comments, questions, rejoinders here or online? And if not, wonderful talk, Peter. Thanks so much.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, everybody.